So I guess we'll get started. Hi, everybody. So I'm not looking at Instagram right now, but I'm going to keep track of my questions here. So, Leah, getting started. So, Rome's Jewish history is 2,000 years old. It's the oldest Jewish community in Europe. How has the community evolved over a millennia?
Yes. Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you to the JCC for having us, and thank you to David for agreeing to do this. Okay, raise your hand if you've been to Rome. Okay, awesome. Raise your hand if you've been to the Jewish quarter of Rome. Okay, so we got a lot of familiarity. Raise your hand if you've been to Kefico. Okay, I want to see everyone's hand up on that category after tonight.
Good test.
So the first Jews who came to Rome came as emissaries of the Maccabees. So if you're familiar with the Hanukkah story and the Jews who were kind of fleeing or being persecuted under, kind of ancient Greek rule at the time, they came to Rome, and basically, I don't know if they found like the friendliest reception, but they found at least, a tolerant reception, and were able to kind of establish a community there. And there are Roman Jews today who say that they can trace their lineage back to Roman times. I don't know how they do that. I don't know what paperwork they have, but they consider themselves ancient Romans and also ancient Roman Jews. There's sort of a second category of the community, or thread of the community, that arrived from Spain and Portugal and Sicily in the 15th and 16th century. Anyone want to shout out the historical reason why? Anyone? Inquisition, yes. So the Spanish Inquisition.
No one ever expects it.
The Spanish Inquisition was, a really pivotal time in the development of, Jewish history. And because Sicily at the time was under the rule of Spain, all of the rules, which were either you have to convert to Catholicism or flee or be murdered, great options. A lot of them moved northward to Rome. And then in the 1960s, about 4,000 Jews from Libya immigrated to Rome. They brought with them North African food traditions, couscous, tagines, obsession with garlic even more than Italians have. And so in this community today, which is about 17,000 people, you have these three kind of culinary and cultural strands. And so it's amazing to me, like, how diverse the cuisine is and how just historically relevant it all is. So yeah, that's a good place to start.
So Rome's Jews were forced to live in the ghetto for more than 300 years. What was it like for them during those centuries? And what did that period of intense persecution shape their community, and how did that intense persecution shape their community and cuisine?
Yeah. So the most important, I would say, moment of Roman Jewish history is the 300 plus years they lived in the ghetto. The word ghetto is actually originally an Italian word. It literally means copper foundry, like a place where like copper, I think, weapons are forged. And the reason the word became tied to, the neighborhood was because the first ghetto was actually not in Rome, it was in Venice. It was about 40 years earlier. And the literal neighborhood where the Jews were forced to live was next to a copper foundry, or a ghetto. So it's literally, that's how the name became associated. And now, of course, language and linguistics do what they do, and it means other things today. But so Rome's ghetto, prior to the Roman Jewish ghetto, Jews kind of lived everywhere in the city. There weren't that many of them, but they specifically lived in a neighborhood called Trastevere, which, if you go to Rome, is like such a beautiful neighborhood to walk around. It's right along the Tiber River, and there's a restaurant called like Spirit and something in that neighborhood that actually used to be a synagogue that, like an 11th century synagogue that housed like the mikveh and like all sorts of things. And it's the oldest still intact synagogue in Rome. So go check that one out. That's lesser known. But in 1554, I believe it was, the Pope at the time said, okay, there's a lot of Jews here. We don't we don't trust them. We want them to be Catholic. So we're not gonna do an inquisition, but we're going to round them all up. And basically, they were compelled to live in this very small, very cramped, not a lot of sunlight, right along the other side of the Tiber River, which flooded 2 times a year. Like just really undesirable real estate. And they were forced to live there for 300 years. It was locked and gated at night, so they could leave during the day, but they had a curfew and had to come back. During that time, there were just like restriction upon restriction. They could only do a few professions. One of them, interestingly, is they could sell fried food on the street, which is why there's a lot of fried food in Roman Jewish cuisine. They had to go to mass on Sundays right outside of every gate of the ghetto. Even today, there's a church, and they had to listen to the priest give the mass. And there's a local legend that they stuffed their ears with cotton or wax so they didn't have to hear it, which, again, I don't know what people's sources are, but I like it as a resistance. We're going to stand there, but we're not going to listen. And, it was a really horrible time. I mean, they were impoverished and didn't have a lot of resources. But what came out of that time of, 300 years of just thousands of people living essentially on top of each other was a very well-defined, tight-knit community that was really bonded, and those bonds exist even today, and a cuisine that is unlike any other I've had in a Jewish context before. So, I don't know if I wouldn't call it a silver lining, but it is why the ghetto is why Roman Jewish food is what it is today.
So you're not actually Roman yourself, right?
What gave that away?
So what compelled you to write a book about Roman Jewish cuisine?
Yeah. So I've been writing about Jewish food for about 15 years, 17, I don't even know what year are we in. And my background is Eastern European, Lithuanian and Russian on one side, and German, not Jewish, on the other side. So, but food-wise, a lot of overlap and Ashkenazi type food. And so I grew up eating matzo balls, and I grew up eating brisket, and I grew up eating potato latkes and all the things that I love so much. But you can only write so many stories about those things before you're like, okay, enough matzo ball stories. So early in my career, I started to, delve more into like Sephardic cuisine and Middle Eastern, Mizrahi, cuisine. And right around that time, my husband and I took a trip to Rome. It was our honeymoon. And we really delved into the Jewish community and took the tours and met with a lot of people. And we ended up having a Shabbat dinner at a kosher caterer's house. His name's Giovanni. He's still a friend of mine today. And I promise I'm answering your question with this story. So I had been a vegetarian for 10 years at that point, and we get to his house, and everything on the table was meat. Everything. There was a tiny plate of polenta, and then everything else there was stracotto di manzo, which is their beef stew with red wine and tomato passata. It's so delicious. And there was a veal and chicken meatball stew with celery, batons of celery, just celery holding its own, not hiding in a sofrito, which I loved. And I remember I turned to Yoshi and I was like, my husband, and I was like, if the phrase "when in Rome" ever applies, it's tonight. And I'm going to eat everything. And I did. And I'm not a vegetarian anymore. Not specifically from that meal. But how it relates to why I wrote this book is that night, nothing on the table was familiar to me, right? These were dishes I had never eaten, let alone in a Jewish context. But because we were at a Shabbat table, and because, we like said the blessing over the wine and over the bread, and we were within minutes talking like old friends, all of those dishes immediately felt familiar. Like I felt a connection to them because of the context. And it was this moment for me where I really realized that Jewish food is so broad and so deep and so diverse that I could have a shot at making a career of telling Jewish food stories. So in some ways, my career as a Jewish food writer started in earnest at that table. And so when I was thinking about what book I wanted to write after the Jewish cookbook, which is like more of an encyclopedia style book, I was like, I want to go personal. I want to do something meaningful, and I want to give back to this community because it means a lot to me. So I'm not Roman. I've been doing Duolingo for 3 years. I'm doing my best on Italian. And I really focus the book on telling the stories of the people of Rome, and David's story, by the way, which I want to get to in a second, a little bit, but because it's their stories to tell.
So tell us a little bit about the significance of the name Portico, the title.
Yeah. Anyone who works in publishing or books knows that titles matter more than they ever did, because it's all about SEO and, a book that immediately tells you what it is. I know Diane Jacobs here. She'll be able to tell you more about that than I do. But I really wanted this book to have a more evocative title than, I love the Jewish cookbook, but that's a really boring title. And so my publisher, who I love, Norton, was like, we want to call it the Roman Jewish Cookbook. And I was like, oh, okay. I just wanted it to be more poetic and more evocative than that. And the reason I chose Portico, and thank goodness they listened, they're a really good publisher and they heard me, was when you go to Rome today and you go to the Jewish ghetto, at one side there's literally a portico, which is an ancient ruin that's been there for thousands of years, and it kind of is like the most imposing structure aside from the temple, the great temple there, and for 300-ish, no, I think even longer, more like 500 years, it was a fish market. And that's where the Jews got a lot of their sustenance, especially during ghetto times. Although, funnily enough, they weren't allowed to buy large fish. They had to buy just the small fish. Seriously, like there was a marble slab, and if you put the fish on the slab and the fish head and tail flopped over the sides, those were saved for the Christians. So that long and winding answer. I loved the idea of just the physical structure of the portico, and you can actually see it when you open the first couple of pages. It's in there, and the word portico actually means like front porch. Portico de Ottavia means Octavia's porch. And I just liked the idea of the metaphor of like a front porch being like something that welcomes you in and you walk through it. And so I thought there was something nice and metaphorical about like being able to enter into this cuisine that a lot of people aren't familiar with. And yeah, that's the name.
So one of my favorite vegetables to cook and to eat is an artichoke. I've had my own kind of enjoyment of a task that I think a lot of people in restaurants find to be really annoying and grueling. But I love cleaning artichokes. I love turning artichokes. It's something like
Bless you.
I mean, we have videos of our restaurant doing like 10 cases of artichokes for one night worth of cacioffi alla Giudia. And anyone who's been to Rome knows that the Romans have a love affair with them. Can you talk a little bit about how the artichoke became so central to the cuisine?
Yes. And I will say, we're in California, where I think there's more artichoke understanding than anywhere else in the country. And even so, like all you do, I'm not from California, but is steam it and like dip it in butter, which is an amazing way to eat an artichoke. But there are so many other things you can do. And Roman Jews, I think, more than anyone I've ever seen, have an obsessive love affair with artichokes that dates back to the 15th and 16th century, when the artichoke came up with the Sephardi Jews, who had learned about it from the Moors of Spain, where it was cultivated for many, many hundreds of years, and North African and Arab traders who had brought it to Sicily and introduced it. And most folks said, ooh, this is a thistle, and this is sharp, I don't want to eat it. And because the Jews didn't have a lot of means, and maybe for other reasons, they adopted it into their cuisine first, so much so that it was called the Jewish vegetable in southern Italy. And it was only, later that it became more widely loved. But when I was researching this book, and I went to Rome with the photographer, Kristen Teague. I hope you guys ogle at her photos because they're amazing. But we we overheard these two elders in the Jewish ghetto neighborhood, which obviously the Jews don't have to live there anymore, but many of them come and hang out, especially the elders. And they were literally in almost coming to blows over how you trim an artichoke. Like one of them was like, my mother did it this way, and you have to use this type of knife, and the other one was like, that's absolutely wrong, and they literally were getting up in each other's faces, and it was incredible. So yeah, and when you go to the Roman ghetto today, any restaurant you go to will have carciofi alla Judia, which is a deep fried artichoke, which you guys have on your menu, right? And they're stunningly amazing to make, and I have a recipe for them, but they're also a pain in the butt if you don't have a team of people to break down your artichokes. So I say, if you want carciofi alla Judia and it's like Hanukkah, make them. Otherwise, book a ticket to Rome and go eat them there, and then make some of the other artichoke recipes in the book. I'm actually curious, do you serve them straight up with lemon, or do you do a dipping sauce? Or
So we've gone through iterations, and I don't want to co-opt this answer, but I will tell a very quick,
please,
funny story. So as a chef, you go through your journey, and it's very hard. Simplicity is the hardest thing. As an artist, as a craftsperson, simplicity is the hardest thing, because when you've kind of decided, hey, I'm going to do one thing, and I'm going to put it on a plate, and that's it. It's very hard for you to justify your art form or your craft, right? And all the cool things that you've learned at the 3 Michelin star restaurants you've worked at. And the first couple months that we opened, it was springtime, and I put a gussied up version on my menu. And I swear, I got a handwritten note in the mail that said, "Sir, carciofi alla Judia is to be served with nothing besides artichoke. You should have more courage."
Wow.
And that's it. And then signed with the person's name.
Wow.
And it was it's mind-blowing how amazing people can be with their feedback. But it's funny. I did not appreciate it in the moment. And I certainly would never suggest anybody ever write someone else a note like that. But it is interesting that there's some truth in that, right? And so now, through my journey of cooking, I've really leaned more towards the idea of doing less to food, right? And knowing that I know what I know what I've done, and I know what I'm capable of, and my work has been done in the sourcing of the vegetable, in properly trimming it and cleaning it, and then in serving it simply, and what I deem to be perfectly, and and that's that.
And that's so true to, I think, Italian cooking in lots of places, and especially was the experience that I learned from the people I cooked with. They were like, don't add lemon zest. It doesn't have lemon zest in it. There are a few times where I add the lemon zest anyway, because I think Americans have different palates and want that. But I always say, the original recipe is just this, 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 and this is how I've changed it. Because,
by the way, it's okay. It's okay to cook food the way you want it to be.
Totally.
Right? That's the beauty. You know, and that's where I would push back on your thing of don't be afraid. Go cook it and mess it up and do anything you want to it. It's your kitchen. That's the beauty of cooking at home.
It's more the amount of oil you have to figure out what to do with after.
Yeah.
You got to find someone who has a biodiesel car that will take it from you. I will share a quick story that reminded me of. So when I went to Rome for the first like 9-10 months of working on the book, I couldn't go because it was there were still travel restrictions, and I literally wasn't allowed to fly to Italy. And as soon as those like early pandemic restrictions ended, I like was on the next plane, and it was amazing to be able to go back and like confirm the memories that I had by putting my feet back on the ground. But I was at my friend Michaela's house. I write about her a lot in the book. She's a tour guide there, and she's incredible. And we were at her house. It was Sukkot, and she had bought some pizza bianca, which is kind of like a flatter focaccia, crunchy, crispy, yummy focaccia type thing. She'd bought it at the bakery, and she had tomatoes, and she had fresh mozzarella, and she had concha, which is a recipe in the book. It's like a fried and marinated zucchini. And she's like, hey, can you make some sandwiches? And I said, sure. And so she was doing something else, and I was slicing the pizza bianca, and I put a little tomato, and I put a little mozzarella, and I put a little concha. And she saw me, and she's like, what are you doing? She's like, you don't put all of it on one sandwich. You either do mozzarella and concha or mozzarella and tomato. And I literally was like, why? Like, I did not understand why she was upset about it. And she's like, well, that's the tradition. That's how we do it. And it made me realize, like, to your question about me not being Roman, like, I'm an American, and I'm coming to these recipes with an American sensibility. And to me, that's like a caprese sandwich, like salad on a sandwich. Obviously, I made them to her specifications, and although I made her try one of the ones I made, and she begrudgingly said it tasted okay. She's like, it's not how my grandmother would do it, but it's all right. But it just, I wanted to bring that sensitivity of the fact that, like, I'm coming with my own very American more is more bias with these recipes. So, yeah.
Try getting Italians to try pineapple on pizza. That's its own challenge. So, which dishes would you say are the most iconic to Roman Jews?
The conchas, the zucchini dish is definitely one of them. It's an amazing dish where you slice the zucchini either in planks or in coins, and the people will tell you one is right and one is wrong, but then the other person will tell you the opposite. And you fry it, and then you marinate it with garlic and fresh basil and red wine vinegar, and you let it sit forever, or an hour or two, and it just like softens, becomes really silky. And you can either eat it as a side, or like toss it with pasta, or put it on a sandwich, not with tomato. So that's an amazingly iconic one. Another is the stracotto di manzo that I mentioned earlier, the beef stew. It's kind of like their brisket, but they use traditionally shin meat. It's kind of gross to point to my actual shin. But you can use any like braising cut. And just there's something about the alchemy of the olive oil and the tomato passata and the red wine and onion that, like, over time you don't need anything else. It just becomes this like velvet sauce. It's so good. And then the pizza ibraica, which are in the back, the little cookies with all the stuff in them. They're supposed to be like, big bars, but those are not good for serving to a group. So I'm glad that she made them small. But in Rome, when you go, there's this bakery called Boccioni. Has anyone been to Boccioni? Raise your hand. A couple people. So it's this like tiny kosher bakery that's been run by the same family for over 200 years. They are so mean when you go in there. You have to know exactly what you're ordering. It's like the Seinfeld soup Nazi. They're that, but cookies. And the first time I went there, I was just like, oh my gosh, what do I want? But I made it through. And they're best known for pizza ibraica, which are it's not sauce and cheese and dough. It's a bar cookie. It was actually Pope John Paul II's favorite cookie. There's a letter from him at the bakery that says, like, this is my favorite cookie in Rome.
Sorry for everything we did.
Well, he was like the I'm sorry Pope. Good guy, and he really. I think he also had some heart trouble and wasn't allowed to have cholesterol. And everything they make, their cookies are made with oil instead of butter.
Subversive.
I know. Yeah. So, anyways, those three I would say are the most iconic. Oh, and the artichokes, obviously, carciofi.
So, I mean, I probably would gather that a lot of us are interested in this kind of period where Jews from Libya immigrated, which is the 1960s, to Rome. How have they and their cuisine been incorporated into the larger story of Roman Jewish cuisine?
Yeah. So they've been there, I guess, 67. They came after this, the 6 Day War of 1967, when it became, not habitable for Jews of Arabic speaking countries. And because Libya had been a colony of Italy, a lot of Libyans spoke at least some Italian, if not fluent. So it was just kind of a natural place for them to end up. And at first, they were met with a lot of xenophobia from the Jewish community because, this community had been around 2,000 years and was very, we are Roman Jews and this is who we are, and like, who are you guys? So, I spoke to a couple of people who came when they were, children, or the children of people who came, and they said that it was tough and they weren't really accepted right away. Now, 60, 70 years on, you're seeing a lot of, intermarried families where like one side is Roman Jewish and one side is Libyan Jewish. And so you're starting to also see the intermingling of the cuisines. One of my favorite examples is I went to a dinner where they served stracotto, the beef stew, but normally you serve it over rigatoni, and they served it over couscous. So it was kind of a literal mixing of the two cuisines. And, I had a few people, even when I interviewed them, that said, the Libyan Jews have been here, but they shouldn't be a part of the book. This is people in Rome because they're not really Roman Jews. And I was just kind of like, that doesn't sit right with me. And then I finally spoke to this one woman who was like, no, they're just a newer thread in an ancient tapestry. And like when she said that, I was like, okay, of course, I'm going to include their. Also, it's really delicious. um, so I try really hard to capture a decent amount of Libyan dishes in there. There's some tagines and there's fifel shuma, which is their like hot sauce. And one of my favorite dishes is the last recipe in the book. It's a mint tea with roasted peanuts in it, like in it. So you get like a little snack with your sweet mint tea. It's wildly delicious. Unexpected and delicious. But yeah, you're starting to see it there. And actually, around that same time period, a little later, your family moved through Rome, right? On their immigration story.
A little bit later. That was
a little later.
79 or 80?
Okay. But like same general.
1980. My mom is there to confirm.
Can you tell us a little bit about their time in Rome? Or maybe your mom should come up and tell.
Well, so anyone who's familiar with the immigrant story of the former USSR, like it's this very stressful, like, and I've only heard about it, right? My brother was born there and I was born here, so I only hear about it, and it's a very stressful ordeal, right? Because first of all, you're making the statement that you're moving to Israel at the time, right? Because that's what was allowed. You couldn't say America or anything like that. And even in your mind, if you're like, I know I'm going to America, I know I'm going to somewhere else, but you had to say, oh, I'm going to Israel, and I won't do it justice, obviously, but like the way it's been told to me is that during that time everything was owned by the state, right? It's communism. And so they would tell you what it is that is yours that you could bring. And it was very little. If you had books, right? Like those didn't belong to you. If you had too many things, right? Like they didn't belong to you, especially if you were Jewish. And so, there was a lot of kind of like back and forth as to like when they were going to go. And from what I understand, there was like a call looking for my dad that the police or the KGB wanted to ask questions about some dealings that he had, and they didn't know what date they were going to go, and the decision kind of got made within like a night or a day, like, yeah. So basically, it was that night, like, hey, we're leaving tonight, and nobody else knew. And they were like, we're going to a party, and we're going to tell everybody at the party that we're leaving now. And sorry, Mom. My mom's like getting well done. And so and it's tough, right? Because during that time, not everybody was a believer, right? Like they're like, well, what are you doing? Like you're going to make things worse for us when you leave. Like they're going to come asking us questions. And my mom will also credit my father. My dad really had this view, and if you can imagine like what it's like to have this view of the American dream, the world you live in is telling you nothing but propaganda and saying that in America there's like filth and squalor and like people are killing each other on the street. You don't want to go there. America is terrible. And like that's what you thought. And imagine you have that foresight. You have a belief. You have a faith in your mind, and you're like, no, America is where we're going to be free to be who we are. And my dad told my mom that that's where they would have a better life. And that night they schlepped all of their stuff to the train station, and they're looking, the military or the police, they're looking through all of your things, and they're telling you this, no, you can't take this, you can't take this photo, you can't take this book. And what are you going to do? Okay, I'm just going to go. You have a 3-year-old in tow. And they get on the train, and it's very stressful because you're going through the borders. And when you get to one border, military come on, and they've got their weapons, and they're walking through. And I'm sure you're feeling like at some point they could pull you off because they weren't supposed to be going to where they were going, right? Like if somebody got wind.
Where was their ticket to?
Well, their ticket was to Austria, right? Like, or to Austria and then to Rome. Okay. But you could not say you were going to America. That would land you in the gulag. And so the military would be coming on and checking, and they could be very forceful. And plus, you were leaving, right? And they didn't like that to begin with. Even though they didn't want you there because you were Jewish, they still didn't like the fact that you were leaving, and they weren't going to make it easy on you. And there's this like very riveting story that my mother has told me many times in my life, and that they got to the last border that was within the USSR, and the military came on one last time to check everything and to look at it. It was very stressful, and the dogs, German shepherds are coming around, and then they had crossed the border. And the train had slowed down just enough for some other people to come on. And those other people were wearing plain clothes, but also carrying automatic weapons. And my mom is, just everybody's wondering what's going on. And someone leans to my mom or tells her, like, no, that those are men from Israel. And they've come here to make sure that all the Jews get to where they're going safely. And so, they had then got to Rome, and at that time they say, we want to go to the United States. And so they say, well, if you're going to go to Israel, like it would happen tomorrow, but because you want to go to the United States, you have to go through this whole other asylum experience, and you have to wait here and kind of hang out in Rome for a while, right? So that's when the romance started. And
how long were they in Rome?
A few months, right? Like, and
didn't your dad try Coke or something for the first time, or am I misremember that story?
I never heard that story.
Okay,
but if you were talking to him,
no,
let me know.
This is one of the other chefs I spoke to. Okay.
I don't. No. Definitely.
Okay.
Definitely not my dad.
Listen to record or something.
No. Oh, so if you're okay, so definitely not Coke for the first time.
Okay.
I mean, I don't know. I don't think my dad's done Coke, but no.
Coca-Cola.
Oh.
I wouldn't doubt your father.
I'm like, man, this became very personal.
I don't know where your head is, David, but
different generations, whatever. It was the 80s. Sorry. So Coca-Cola.
But
no, so
it's record.
well, no. So the thing is, no, the record story. So the thing is, back then in the USSR, you couldn't own anything. You couldn't just like people. I think have this misconception as to like what it's like to live in a place like that. It's not like, oh, I have money, I'm just gonna go somewhere and buy something, right? Like there wasn't none of that. You couldn't just go buy something. You had to like trade it on the black market. So like my parents got to Italy and they're like, you mean you can go into a record store and buy records and trade goods for money? Incredible. I love that idea. And so like anybody who's been to my restaurant, if you see the wallpaper in the private dining room or in the restroom also of Adriano Celentano, which is a very famous pop star of that time, my everyone was in love with his music. And so my parents got to Rome and they're like, you mean we can buy these records? And they bought the records, and I remember growing up and hearing these records growing up of Adriano Celentano. And you guys are gonna think I'm a little dumb, but I remember being like a kid and asking my mom. I must have been a young kid, but I looked at my mom. I was like, "Mom, is this Russian music?" And she looked at me like I was so stupid. She's like, "No, this is Italian. What are you talking about?" I'd be like, well, I guess it makes sense." But I never understood why we had all these like tie-ins to Italian culture, and it was because my mom and dad that was their first kind of experience of freedom.
But no Coke.
No.
Probably not. Thank you for sharing that. That's the journalist in me. I'm going to turn all the questions back on you. I actually do have one other question for you, and then I don't know. Are we at the point where we need to start doing audience questions? Okay, we're good. Okay. So I know at Kefico you do a few. A number of dishes that are from kind of like Italian Jewish, not just Roman, but different parts of Italy inspiration, and that you mark them on your menus with a Jewish star. And I'm just wondering, like, yeah, I'm wondering, like, first how you decided to, want to have Roman Jewish and Italian Jewish dishes on the menu, and then why you kind of decided to bring that piece of education into the restaurant experience.
So those are two very different answers, and I'll tell the reason why I like the food and why I wanted to do it before I'll talk about the Jewish stars, and I'll make that story very brief. Which is, as a chef, you travel the world and you love cooking and you fall in love with cuisines, and I think like internally you try and find your own identity in that cuisine sometimes, right? And I remember traveling to Rome and my dad telling me like, "Hey, like you know that Rome has the oldest Jewish ghetto, in the world, and you should go check it out." Like once again, I felt very ignorant. I was like, "What are you talking about? Jewish ghetto in Rome?" I knew nothing about it. I was completely unaware, and I just remember walking through it and just feeling like it's weird, right? Like it's weird how as a Jewish person you can walk through the world and have zero real like tangible connection to something, yet you walk through it and you feel like it's everything about you. And I imagine that's how, you know, in a much different way, it's how it is if people had visited Auschwitz, right? Like you feel so connected, almost in like too powerful of a way. Like you don't know what to do with that power exchange that's happening there. And I felt the same way in the ghetto, and I felt like that there was a part of my identity there, and I wanted to connect to it. The Jewish stars are a completely different thing, to be honest, and so I was meant to be honestly subversive and in a way to force people to know that they were eating somewhere that was owned by a Jew. And I didn't want anyone to be able to walk away not knowing. My mom and dad, they sacrificed everything to come and be Americans to where they could be a proud Jews and say they were Jewish without, ironically I say this during today's time, but to say being Jewish without fear of anything. And I know, for especially for some of you of a different generation, I say like I'm a tattooed Jew, and some of you are like, no, it's not
I'm
really.
tattooed also.
Yeah, not.
Sorry,
But
guys.
but
Two
look,
tattooed
like,
Jews
but
up on stage here.
right, but I will say, my when I got my first tattoo, it was of a mezuzah on my back, and I got that when I was 16 years old, and I wanted that tattoo for a very similar reason. Is I wanted. I mean, um, I've never been a passive person. And I grew up fighting a lot, and as my dad grew up fighting a lot, and as an adult, like I've grown, um, and like I try not to utilize that as a method for resolution. But as a kid, where I grew up, how I grew up, my dad also, as a Soviet Jew, if you wore a Star of David on you, that was a sign of defiance. Like you were asking for it. And I think I'm my father's son, and I wanted people to know that regardless of their feelings of my Judaism, I was not going to hide that from them.
I think that's awesome. And it also reminds me of like a lot of the restaurants in Rome, in the Jewish ghetto, starting in the late 90s. Really, there were restaurants, that did old Roman food and would have a few Jewish dishes on the menu because Jewish food is so ancient there that it's hard to know when something's alla Romana, like Roman style, and alla Judia, Jewish style. They overlap. But starting in the late 90s, there were restaurants that were like, no, we're going to do Jewish food. We're going to do Roman Jewish food proud, and we're going to be proud of it. And now you have, when you go into the ghetto, like all of these restaurants that are just proudly serving these dishes that I think for a long time held a lot of shame. And so I think it's a cool way for them, and it's also, funnily enough, like the ghetto is now like one of the trendiest, hottest real estates in the city. And movie stars live there. And the only Jewish families who really lived there were the ones who were too poor to move out when they had the opportunity. So now they're sitting on hot real estate. Lucky them, lucky them. Yeah, but so there's just like a reclaiming, which it sounds kind of like a similar, or a planting your flag of who you are in a proud way.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Do we have any questions?
Oh, lots. Okay. I saw some hands just a second ago. Oh.
Yeah, I'm born and raised here. I'm the first person in my family born in the United States. My mom opened her chiropractic office on Fillmore and O'Farrell 30 years ago. 35, excuse me. Sorry, Mom. 35 years ago. We grew up in the East Bay. My dad had a business on Geary, and so I very much consider myself like have grown up in San Francisco, right? I remember I used to kind of like play around the shopping center over there by Safeway on Fillmore, and now it's such like a trendy place to have restaurants and everything like that. But I grew up here. We got a room full of Jews here. I feel like projection is not an issue. We're all theater kids.
All right, can you hear me? Yeah. All right. So I have a question for you, Leah. I can take it. Oh, okay. When you dove into this niche of Roman, Italian, Jewish cooking, did you stumble upon other parts of the diaspora, particularly like the Sephardic parts of the diaspora, that you considered pivoting towards, or that maybe would be sequels? Maybe it's Portuguese Jewish food or French Jewish food, and which ones do you think have the most opportunity right now to gain representation that aren't already out there?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a few books out there that already exist that I think do a great job. Joan Nathan's Quiches, Kugels, and Couscous, which is a French Jewish book, and talks in a similar way that there's Libyan Jews in Italy, there's Algerian Jews in France, so there's a lot of North African influence there. I would say Indian Jewish cuisine is a really big one, and there's a book that came out last year called Bene Appetit or Appetite that explores that. And then there's a chef actually in New York City named Biji Barhani, who's an Ethiopian Jew, and I think she's working on a cookbook right now. So I'm excited about that one. And then last year I helped. There's a Mexican Jewish cookbook coming out that I didn't write, but I helped them develop some of the recipes. That's coming out next. I think Rosh Hashanah, like a year from Rosh Hashanah. So I'm really excited about that one because Mexico, the evolution of Jewish food in Mexico right now is really live. It's happening right now with like the younger generation, which are like third generation Ashkenazi Jews in Mexico. So you're starting to see like matzo ball soup with chipotle peppers in it, or like babka with Mexican cinnamon and Mexican chocolate, and like really exciting stuff. So I'm excited for that one. I actually am working on another book, but I can't talk about it just yet. But it's less niche than Roman Jewish food. So yeah, I'm going a little broader, not too broad.
You want to hold it? Okay. Hi, you guys make a great duo. The combination is really interesting and fascinating. I had the good fortune of going to Rome this past May for a family wedding. One of my relatives married into the Roman Jewish community. So I was at the Great Synagogue, I was in El Ghetto for several kosher meals that were sponsored, and I saw the portico and all of that. You both alluded to your backgrounds and how your personal experiences added up to what you're doing now. So my question is, and it's a good segue from the previous question, what is the Jewish American twist on all of this from your perspective? We've talked about Roman Jewish food and its history and your Soviet background, and kudos to your parents. But what are we doing now here? What do you see as us doing now as the Jewish American twist? And one thought I had earlier when you talked about the sort of ritual continuity of the Roman Jewish community, you can understand why they needed to keep their context and their rituals and their tradition together. That's what kept them together as a community. But here, anything goes, right? We're Americans. So what are we adding to the cuisine scene in terms of Jewish cuisine?
That's a really hard question for me to answer. I'm not sure I have a really good one, except for I remember, my parents bringing me to New York a lot because we had another generation of family who they didn't know when they were in the USSR, but they came here and reconnected. And I remember as a kid, we would go there and you'd be driving through Queens and you'd be like, glatt kosher Indian food, glatt kosher, Chinese food, glatt kosher sushi. I feel like, isn't that the American thing, right? We take all the stuff from everywhere else and we're like, this is awesome. We love it. Let's do some of that here. And so I think to that point, right, like of the Mexican, Mexican Jewish food sounds incredible to me. Like, I love that. Yeah. And I think I think this is the place where you come to experience those things. Like, I remember graduating from high school and I was in LA for a summer and I decided to take a Jewish studies class, and it was the first time I had ever met an Orthodox person in real life. And she was a girl, and I didn't even know whether I was allowed to speak to her or not. And she was from a Persian community and invited me to go to her shul. And so I was like, okay, sure. Like, I'm completely intimidated. I had no idea what I was doing. So first of all, I had no idea that the place I was going to, I wasn't going to sit next to her. And so we go to the thing, and they're like, oh, okay, you sit over here. I had no idea what I was doing. I was just kind of went through the stuff. When people like rocked, I rocked. And, I did my best. I'm telling you, after that experience, we walked outside, and there was a table of food that I had never seen. And I was like, this can be Jewish food? This is incredible. The flavors and all the different things that were involved, and I was like, Jewish food can be so many things. And I think that's probably the American way of we do everything, right? Which is like, everybody comes here, right? Give us your hungry, give us your, what is the rest of it? Tired, your huddled masses, right? Like that's the American way, isn't it?
I hope it continues to be, yes. That's another discussion. uh, in New York, I'm lucky enough to see a lot of exactly what you're kind of alluding to. Like there's a lot of restaurants, not a lot, there's a handful of restaurants that are doing kind of Jewish food in interesting new ways. And what I'm seeing is a mishmash of the global Jewish scene on one menu, right? Like they'll have this place called Edith's in Edith's Grocery in Williamsburg in Brooklyn. They have like a tahini slushy, and then they also have like like a kasha varnishka. Like it's just like everything together. What worries me about that is like a journalist and a food historian light person is that like we're gonna lose the threads of where all those foods come from, and it's just going to be all mishmashed. And but it is exciting culinarily to be able to go and have like a little bit of Moroccan food and a little bit of Eastern European food, and just kind of take inspiration from across the global diaspora. So you're starting to see a little of that.
I'm gonna take this. Oh, take this one right here.
Your cookie's really good. I'm curious, are you, and I don't mean to go dark now, but obviously there's so much going on right now. Are you worried with the Star of David's on your menu now? Are you worried about the camaraderie amongst your staff now?
So you asked two very different questions. I'll answer the second one first. I try not to speak for my staff. We're in San Francisco, California, and I don't know if any of you follow me on Instagram, but I've had a few posts recently, and one of them in particular that I pointed out was that I do not follow the majority of my staff on Instagram, and I implore them not to follow me, because the ones that I do follow, I've known for about 5 or 6 years, and we have a very deep relationship, and we have a rapport that I think goes beyond feeling differently about something, right? We can have a conversation. And I think that's what should be the beauty of American culture and civilization, is we can have a conversation and we can disagree. Where the problem becomes is when, bless you, when we start to have beyond a conversation, and either you want to turn it into harassment, or if there's something beyond having a debate or a conversation. As Jews, I think we should always debate, right? It's part of our identity. So I don't want to speak for my staff, because they're all free to have their own feelings all the time. They are expected to greet everyone in our space with hospitality. And I mean that, everyone. If someone came in with a swastika tattoo on their arm, I would expect them to be treated with hospitality, because we have a restaurant and we serve food to people. And if someone came in with a Palestinian flag or something else, as long as that's what all they were doing, I would be expected that they would be treated with hospitality. So that's the answer to the thing. I can't answer for my staff, and I don't want to, and I don't want to make them feel uncomfortable. But at the end of the day, my name is on the lease. And my risk and my livelihood is at stake. And I spent the time, and I made the risks, and I spent my entire life getting to the point where I could have the platform to say something that I believe in. And the Jewish part of the identity of my business is inextricable from the Jewish part of me, and the fact that we are the same. And so if people are willing to earn money because the Jewish stars are there and people come and spend money on those dishes, then they shouldn't have a problem with the fact that I also want to I'm proud of that, right? It's not a political statement, it's a statement of identity. And that's who I am, and that's the place that you're dining in.
I have a comment and a question. So I have a food column in the J, the local paper that I've been writing for 15 years.
Love that place.
And David, I just want to say to you that I think I told you this when I interviewed you, however many years ago you opened Que Fico, that you still to this day in 15 years are like the most unabashedly proud Jewish chef that I've ever interviewed him for my column. So I just want to say that. And I remember you saying to me then that part of the Jewish stars on the menu and the Jewish dishes was about an FU to Trump and the white supremacists, because I think Charlottesville had just happened when we spoke, or maybe a couple months earlier. So that's something that I remember about our interview, and it's stuck with me because it was very, very powerful. Leah, I would love for you to address the fact that so many Jewish dishes are on Italian restaurants all over, and maybe David can speak to this too, and they're not given the recognition that they were come from, the Jewish tradition, like the artichokes. Like you find them on any Italian restaurant menu,
Yeah.
and often they're not given their proper name or their proper due, and that this is a Jewish dish. Do you find that this is still happening? Is it, how pervasive? Like,
Yeah, it happens. I mean, I think that partly has to do with the fact that, like I said before, like some of these dishes are so old that you don't know whether they're alla Romana or alla Judia. Like alla Judia, like the Carciofia alla Judia, the Jewish fried artichoke, has the word Jewish in the name, so that one is pretty hard to disentangle. But I think there's a restaurant in Manhattan called Latanzi, which has been around for a long time, and the chef there is Roman, not Jewish, and he was quoted in the Times as saying, "When I was growing up, we ate all these foods. I had no idea they were Jewish, but now I do, and that's great." But like, I think there's literally like people just don't know. One of my favorite examples is actually caponata, which is not Roman, it's Sicilian. And it's a famous eggplant caponata. Like everybody knows that as a Sicilian dish. It was originally a Shabbat dish. It was part of the Jewish community because it's something you could cook ahead and serve for Shabbat lunch without having to do any active cooking that's prohibited during the Sabbath. But there's no community in the South anymore. That was completely wiped out during the Inquisition, and that dish remained, but over the years, the Jewish connection has fallen away. I don't have any evidence of it being nefarious, like an purposeful erasure, but I'm sure there's a lot of cases where like the food is so it's just so good that it's just kind of blended into the other parts of the world or of the cuisine. Yeah.
We're going to take 2 more questions. I would love to just remind everybody that Leah's going to be signing in the back immediately after the program. There's also some treats. If you haven't had a chance to sample them, there's still some there. And actually, I was hoping that David could say a word or 2 about the sandwiches that he prepared for you all.
Sure, you want me to do that now or after the questions?
Let's do that at the end.
Sure.
But I'd love to make sure that we include it. Okay.
This is great. While waiting for the mic, my questions become more pertinent. One of my hobbies is international folk dance, and there is a huge discussion among some groups right now about the difference between appreciation and appropriation. And you've talked about how in New York you've got Galat Indian and there's that Bernstein's Chinese restaurant and all that other stuff. And you're talking about how in Italy they've kind of absorbed the food without giving the credit to Judaism. So I'm wondering how you see that issue, if at all. Is that something that we have to worry about? Are we taking another culture and changing it in a way that's not appropriate? Are we appreciating what's going on? How does that fit into your cooking and your recipes?
Yeah, I would say 2 things. I think the kosher Indian places and the kosher Chinese places there's no question that the cuisine is still Indian and Chinese. And what's happening is that Jewish people who keep kosher want to eat those foods, and so they're finding ways to make them. They're not calling them Jewish, but because right, kosher and Jewish are two different things. Jewish means culturally, and kosher just means follows the laws of kashrut. So if you're eating like glatt kosher Indian food, you're still eating Indian food. It just doesn't have ghee and meat in the same. They use oil or something to keep it not mixing milk and meat. Jewish cuisine, this is something I talk more about in my other book, the Jewish Cookbook. Jewish cuisine throughout the world is based on foods that Jews have eaten in the places that they've lived and adapted for kashrut and adapted for the laws of the Sabbath and all of that. There are very few dishes that I would say are like originally Jewish, but I don't think that's a negative thing. Because Jews have moved over and over again, sometimes by force, sometimes by choice. And they bring those foods with them, and then they evolve in the new place that they are because they encounter new indigenous ingredients in the place, right? Like you never saw a chipotle pepper in Lithuania, right? So you wouldn't put that in your matzo ball soup, but when that matzo ball soup travels to Mexico, all of a sudden you have all these amazing dried chilies in the market. And I think the beauty of Jewish cuisine is less about innovation and more about adaptation and dissemination, right? Like it's creating this like amazing mosaic. So I don't think it's something to worry about. I think it's something to celebrate as long as the intention is true. You know what I mean? Yeah. Exactly.
I think I have a sensitivity to the whole like appropriation movement, and when I was a kid, I remember like I wanted to be anyone but me, like because I didn't grow up with a bunch of like Eastern European Jews. Like I grew up with black kids and Mexican kids and Samoan kids and Chinese kids and Cambodian kids and Filipino kids. You want to know how bad I wanted to be Mexican? I'm like, dude, everything was so awesome about the culture. I wanted to dress like the boys that I saw. I wanted to date the Mexican girls. I wanted to go to the quinceañeras. I was like, everything about it. I was like, this is amazing. So like, I have a different perspective. Look, and I hear what you're saying. Like, and I do think there is a nefarious type of taking someone's culture and not giving credit, and that's negative. And I don't like that. But I think we do need to get past this kind of thing of like nobody's allowed to do anybody else's stuff. It's not productive. We need to go the other direction, right? Do all the stuff. Love all the stuff, right? But just call out the credit. Call out, like when you go to my restaurant, there's a pizza. It's called the Ode to Judy Pie, right? It's because Judy Rogers was an amazing chef. She unfortunately died. She was the chef of Zuni Cafe. First time I ever had a pizza with raw ricotta salata grated onto it. It was like pivotal for me. I never saw it anywhere else, so I couldn't just say it's the only place I ever had it. So I thought, wouldn't that be lovely if I said to everybody that I'm not this genius that came up with this, but someone else came up with it. And how lovely would it be for them to read this woman's name every day that they come to my restaurant and honor her. And I still get to do the pizza. And so I don't think there's a problem with like loving and appreciating culture. I think we just need to say, I didn't make this up. I didn't create the taco. I love tacos. This is a taco with gefilte fish.
Yum.
So we named so many countries here, and I'm from Israel. So I'm really curious about, David, your connection to Israel. If you've been there, what do you think about the Israeli cuisine, which is so amazing? And do you know some chefs from there? Do they know you, what you're doing, the great work that you're doing?
Man, you're asking me a very, very hard question because I've wanted to go to Israel my entire life, and I've never been because from a young age, I started doing this when I was 13 years old. And from a young age, anytime my mom remembers, I used to get 2 days off for like Thanksgiving, and I would fly back to see her, and I'd have to leave right then. And so I never got any time off to travel. And if I did travel, it was always around, I'm working in a French restaurant, I should go to France. I'm working in an Italian restaurant. I should go to Italy. And it's always been probably like something that I've struggled with. I've always wanted to go. And I love Israeli cuisine. I love all of the different cultures that create Israeli cuisine, because in a lot of ways, Israel can be like an, you know, analogous to United States in that sense of like there are a lot of a melting pot of cuisines, and I think that's the beauty of it. But I think I do know Israeli chefs here in the United States, and I don't know if they know me there, but I would love to go, and anytime anybody wants to invite me. Should we do one more question? Someone's dying. Liz really wants to ask a question. Come on. I promise. It's going to be great.
You guys have been awesome. Thank you.
You guys have been awesome. And honestly, this feels so good to be in this room with all of you who I don't even know, and you guys, so thank you. Tomorrow next Shabbat feels more meaningful than ever. If someone's going to make Shabbat from your book, what's it going to be?
Great question.
Yes.
You should make the stracotto di manzo, which is the beef stew, or the chicken with peppers, which is kind of cacciatore style, but you roast bell peppers, red and yellow bell peppers, and braise the chicken with that and tomato, and it's just very flavorful and delicious. You should make for dessert, the chocolate almond cake, which is kind of like the best flourless chocolate cake you've ever had, because you start with whole almonds and you grind them with the chocolate, so it's got like a brownie, like nubby texture to it. You should make the concha, the zucchini. We're in fall. If you can find cipollini onions in the market, the roasted cipollini onions are amazing. The tomato rice pie. I don't know. You can't go wrong. There's lots of good stuff in there. Oh, actually, the one of the Libyan dishes, it's a vegan vegetable stew that you serve over couscous, like a tagine. It's got turmeric and cinnamon, and it's very delicious. Yeah, anything. Thank you, guys.
So I'll briefly just tell you guys about like the sandwiches that are over there, and I really hope all of you try it. And I'll tell you a funny little story between the three of us. We're all in an email thread, and they're like, "Hey, you want to do a snack?" I'm like, "Sure, I'll do a snack." And so I say, I'm gonna do a veal tongue sandwich with salsa verde, and obviously, you must be both pragmatists, because I got an email back that was very polite and very kind, and basically said, "Are you sure you wouldn't like to do something else?" And
they were very good.
One of my colleagues is with me here, Ali Schaffer in the back. She laughed when I told her the story in the car. She's like, "They don't know you very well, do they?" Because to me, that sandwich is indicative of what I think is important of this culture, which is it's important that we all eat the veal tongue. It's important that we eat the sweetbreads. It's important that we eat the brains and eat all of those things, because number one is, as a chef, I think it is incredibly important that we get away from this kind of factory farming idea of my chicken breast comes in cellophane and plastic wrap and blah, 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 blah. No, an animal has all their parts, and we should be eating them all, and we should be making them delicious. But culturally, it's even more important for us as Jews to try these things and to love them and to eat them, or at least to try them even if you're not going to love them, because the identity of the Italian cuisine the essence was scarta dei mercati, which means the trash of the market. And when you talk about a resilient people who say, "Oh, you're going to give me your trash? I'm going to make something delicious. You're going to give me your hate? I'm going to turn it into love." And I think it's never been more important as Jews to understand what our reason for being in the world is. And that sandwich to me is says it all. Is you take something that the world gives you and you make it beautiful. And so I hope all of you guys try that sandwich, because I love it. It's delicious. The bread was baked fresh this afternoon. The salsa verde is hand chopped. The veal tongue was cooked preciously for 3 days. And I think it's an excellent sandwich, and you should give it a shot. I'm proud of you. Well, she knows what the brand is. She's like, yes, I agree. It's great. So,
Glad you served them. Thank you. Thank you.
well, thank you, everybody, and please get your book signed.
Thanks, everybody.